Thank you. Real privilege to be here, and thanks to Jody for all of her hard work in putting together this panel this morning. My point I'm going to try to make here in the next 15 minutes or so is going to be relatively simple, so kind of hard to follow John in that regard, but as an academic, I'll take 25 slides to get to a relatively simple point here. No financial relationships, that's the disclosure I'm going to make for you this morning. So my objectives are several-fold here. I want to highlight a couple of controversies that have emerged in recent years about the secondary use of data and biospecimens. And a lot of what I'm going to speak about emerges out of the biospecimen literature to a significant extent. Highlight some of the challenges experienced with informed consent for research and learning healthcare systems, and then talk about at least one approach that may be applicable in certain circumstances to move us forward. So here's the general definition, Friedman, from this last year that I'm speaking about, familiar, I think, certainly to this group. Harness the power in data analytics to learn from every patient and feed the knowledge into what works best, etc. So I'm not going to talk about a couple of things. So just for clarity purposes, I'm not really going to talk about the background ethical justification for using information that's provided by patients for secondary purposes. I think, of course, I do feel this is justified, but I think it's a careful set of arguments to decide exactly what the limits of those obligations are. I do think there are distinctions between research and QA, QI, but I really won't emphasize those much today. The NPRM made a significant distinction between data and biospecimens. I'm not going to draw on those distinctions at all today, and nor am I going to talk about pragmatic trials and those sorts of specific circumstances. I think the broader question I want to speak to is how do we manage legitimate and potential concerns around privacy and confidentiality? I think those are the central risks and concerns that patients and research participants have in these particular domains. And similarly, given those concerns, how do we maintain trust in the types of systems that we are developing? So the controversies focus on these secondary uses of data and biospecimens obtained for clinical purposes. So typically no consent is obtained for these secondary uses. And there may be, in some circumstances, a limited notification that such practices exist. I know in our admission agreement to the University of Utah Hospital, there's a single line, 11-point font, that says something to the effect that biospecimens, residual biospecimens, will be used in a way that's consistent with state and federal law. Well, that's a meaningless disclosure and certainly doesn't function to support any reasonable ethical obligations on behalf of the institution. Legal liabilities may well be covered by that. But that's, I think, standard practice for many institutions for many years, and what I think we need to be moving away from. As you all are familiar, federal regulations really allow research to be conducted with data and biospecimens without individual consent in many circumstances, either de-identification or even with identifiers. Oftentimes the waiver criteria are met. This is a domain of research that I think has been highly productive, and I also think the track record for risk has been extraordinarily good. There are virtually no instances of significant, what I would call welfare harms, tangible harms to participants secondary to data use and biospecimen use, secondary uses in the conduct of research. So this approach, I think, has been quite ethically acceptable from the perspective of investigators, IRBs, and those within the academic enterprise. This has seemed to be a fine balance of concepts. But I think the lack of knowledge or consent is not acceptable to many people in the general public, and that's the tension I think we need to be cognizant of here. As mentioned, few welfare harms, I think, have emerged from this sort of research, but really several high-profile circumstances in which individuals, I think, would claim something like a dignitary harm. Things were used without their knowledge, used in ways that they would find unacceptable. I spend quite a bit of my time these days teaching around the Henrietta Lacks case and book. The Havasupai tribal case, also a fascinating one that's taught us quite a bit about the notion of group harms in certain circumstances. Newborn screening lawsuits I'll mention here in a second, and the Moore case, perhaps a more minor case. These are circumstances that the public is increasingly aware of, and I know in my teaching enterprise, particularly around the Henrietta Lacks case, folks are a bit shocked to learn what happened to a certain extent, but then shocked to learn that things haven't changed a bit with respect to the research protections or secondary use protections that were used in the 1950s. So the notice of proposed rulemaking proposed to extend the definition of human subject to biospecimens whether or not they were identifiable. So this was a way of trying to address some of these ethical tensions. Let's bring this sort of research under the fold of oversight by making it clear that it's human subjects research. Broad consent from individuals would be necessary before biospecimens could be used for research, and the criteria for waiver would be significantly limited. What we've also seen in recent years is this significant change in federal policy around the secondary use of newborn screening blood spots. Quite familiar to folks here in Michigan, for sure, given your biotrust. So what this law did, great surprise to folks when this was implemented without any significant prior discussion within the profession, was to say that these dried blood spots is human subjects research, again, regardless of whether they are de-identified or not. Waiver of parental consent was not permissible, and eventually this law would be superseded with changes in the common rule should those come about. So these new consent provisions are extremely difficult to implement, and I can tell you that's basically arrested much of the collection and use of residual blood spots since this was implemented now a year or so ago. Postpartum period is a terrible time to try to be getting informed consent for this sort of abstract concept. And I think what we're seeing is that the consent process itself is resulting in a substantial decrease in the available blood spots for research. So there is a significant price to pay for these provisions. So what have the public responses been to the NPRM? In short, for the most part, the biospecimen criteria were strongly opposed by the academic community. Folks felt that the broad consent approach was meaningless in terms of truly informed consent and a significant barrier and expensive process to maintain. Opposed to a significant extent by the lay advocacy community, too. Those folks who are disease advocates, many of them felt that this also was an inhibition for the conduct of important research. But on the other side, folks who took the time to comment from the general public also were concerned about the new criteria because they didn't want any waiver of consent feasible. So opposed by pretty much everybody, but for polar opposite reasons. So you can see the challenge here with public policy development. So here's my summary of the literature on the biobanking element. People are entirely unfamiliar with secondary uses. Majority of individuals support secondary use when you talk to them about it. You explain what the rationale is, and people get it. But they want to know. They want to know that this is going on. People want a choice about whether their data or biospecimens are used. And if you ask them straight up, would you prefer to have an opt-in or an opt-out sort of approach, they will choose by about 2 to 1 the opt-in. And it's a matter of saying, and we've heard this many times with the focus groups we've run, which said, well, just ask me. How complicated is that? They don't understand that the whole notion of just ask me entails a rather large and complicated enterprise to obtain that consent, track it over time, and honor it. So healthcare systems, I think, have done a lousy job making patients aware that data and biospecimens are used for secondary purposes. This was, I think, very much part of how the public health departments approached the notion of these uses, as well as really the whole clinical enterprise of newborn screening. I think the notion was, let's keep our heads down. The more fuss we make about this, the more we make this apparent and transparent to folks. Folks may choose not to pursue newborn screening, and that would be tragic for babies, so let's keep a low profile. Well, that came back to bite us, the public health system, with the lawsuits with Minnesota and Texas because the public wasn't on board, or at least some members of the public were not on board with that enterprise. So I don't know to what extent the same sort of rationale is going on within academic medical centers, but I think there's some notion that let's not talk about this because it's simply going to confuse people, complicate our mission to pursue a research agenda. So no meaningful permission obtained for these activities, and I think this entails a significant risk of loss of trust of the public when folks realize that what they assumed to be happening with their records and what they assumed to be happening with residual samples was not happening. So I think we have to develop an approach in learning healthcare system that provides information to patients about secondary uses, that's the transparency part, and allows an element of choice in some circumstances. I don't want to be too broad here with that claim. And so here's the gap I think we need to work in. We can think about the variety of different approaches to consent across the spectrum: full consent, broad consent, simple consent process, and then there's this large gap dropping down to the complete waiver or no consent whatsoever. I think there's a lot of creative work to be done where that star sits on the difference between a simple opt-in approach and no consent whatsoever. So that's what I'm going to speak to here for just a second. So we all know that informed consent is problematic. Forms are increasingly long and complicated. We know people are challenged with comprehension even when state-of-the-art approaches are being used in this day and age. But the federal regs don't require comprehension, and accordingly, IRBs pay no attention to that particular ethical element of the consent process. Yet many people consent to research anyhow, which is another reason why we haven't taken made enough effort to make this whole process better. So I think we're familiar with the notion of autonomous authorization as being the core ethical foundation for informed consent. But the question then is, what if autonomous authorization is really not a realistic goal? And I think we've had ample evidence over the last 30 or 40 years that this is really not an achievable goal in a consistent fashion with a large number of individuals. So what are the implications of that? Can we define more limited goals that permit research when fully autonomous authorization can't be achieved? Are there different ways to think about our obligations to sources with respect to things like data and biospecimens? So I want to pick up here on this notion of a fair transaction model of informed consent that was developed by Frank Miller and Alan Wertheimer. And basically the notion here is captured in this quote: "The criteria for assessing the validity of consent transactions should be based on fair terms of cooperation for the respective parties that reflect the content of the activity for which the consent is given." So basically, fairness is relevant both to the participant and the investigators. What fairness entails will vary reasonably depending on the risk-benefit profiles presented by different clinical trials. So high-risk trials, of course, require a higher level of autonomous authorization. Low-risk trials or minimal-risk trials may require a very different approach. And I think this picks up, and they make the point of thinking about how we engage in so many activities of daily living around what we consent to. All of us click the box when the consent information comes forward for buying new software or even significant transactions like mortgages. We pay no attention to that verbiage. We sign it anyhow. Now, is that simply ethically unacceptable practice? Mortgages, they've made a little bit more effort to try to make what you're signing transparent to you, but for the most part, we engage in this sort of activity all the time. So either there's an ethical justification for that, or we've got a lot of work to be done. None of us want to spend our days reading and trying to understand these complex forms, and so we rely on the background institutional structures that protect us in these sorts of circumstances. It's the institutional protections that become the core of the ethical foundation more than autonomous authorization, since we understand that can't be achieved in many circumstances. So I think this transaction model permits a limited disclosure of information when risks are low and institutional protections are in place. And I think it probably permits a limited or no assessment of whether comprehension has been achieved. Secondary research with data and biospecimens, I would claim, is extremely low risk and low burden for the sources. There are strong institutional protections in place that have empirically demonstrated a low rate of impact or risk, high scientific value. And so the claim would be a highly burdensome system to obtain fully autonomous authorization for secondary uses isn't fair to the research enterprise. Limited disclosure is acceptable, and no assessment of comprehension, I think, is acceptable as well. But a complete lack of transparency is not. So the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Human Research Protections that I chaired up until last month, in response to the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, came forward with our recommendation with, rather than broad consent in these contexts, we suggested that a notice and opt-out was a better balance of considerations. And that's really the approach that I'm proposing here in these other sorts of contexts with data and biospecimens. No signature necessary, but if somebody opts out, you can't waive that. You have to honor that decision. So this notice and opt-out approach, we would claim, I would claim, promotes transparency and choice. But the ethical justification is very much contingent on a good faith effort to be transparent. And the Achilles heel for notice and opt-out is burying that notice in some form, someplace, in a brochure that's handed out when folks aren't interested in reading it, and then claiming you've been transparent when in fact you haven't. So it has to be a good faith effort to be transparent. We did study a couple years ago now that I think bears specifically on this. At the University of Utah, we're interested in developing a notice and opt-out approach to exactly this set of issues, and we wanted to know public reaction to that approach. So we developed a 15-minute film that describes how these processes work and then had a series of focus groups across several states. Folks were almost to a person supportive of this approach. And the notion was, well, as long as I know about it and I have an opportunity to choose, then I'm satisfied. And we didn't ask them, would you prefer opt-in, would you prefer opt-out, in terms of an equal question. We said, we're going to approach this with an opt-out, notice an opt-out. Would that be acceptable to you? Folks said yes. So I think recommendations here would be to try to develop a layered approach to disclosure of institutional practices. Most folks really don't care about this set of issues very much, and a limited disclosure is probably sufficient. For those percentages of folks who do care, we ought to have a set of materials available for folks who want to explore the issues in greater detail. IRB approval of disclosure information process, particularly on the research end. And I think what we have to do is make a concerted effort to develop tools that reach people where they are. This whole notion that the doctor is going to sit down for 5 minutes and tell people about this with every clinical encounter is foolish. It's not going to happen. But we have ways to reach out with folks with MyChart and apps and videos and waiting rooms, ways that we can reach people when they have convenient time to look at it, should they have the interest in doing so, and mechanisms to track and honor choice. So I think research in this domain represents a challenging conflict. Transparency and respect for autonomous decision-making is in some conflict with the facilitation of valuable research as we pull data out of the clinical enterprise. I think notice and opt-out is appropriate when the risks are low and institutional safeguards are in place, applicable in many circumstances, and some of the boundaries we might talk about later in the other session. More effective engagement with patients about these practices, I think, is essential to maintain trust. Folks have to be better informed about how we're approaching these issues, and choice then also a serious consideration in many contexts. Thank you.